Hi, it is exciting to be here. I enjoy coming out and talking. Today's just kind of a little funny. Texas was heaven for men and dogs and hell for women and oxen. It's actually a quote of Mary Austin Holly about what Texas was like in the Antebellum period. And so that's what we're going to be talk about. I also actually have very fun coming to Pasadena Public Library because my very first boss in academics was Parker Williams, who started her career as librarian here in Pasadena Public Library before she went to Jacinto College as librarian there, and then later the president for the South Campus. And so she took a chance on a kid wet behind the ears, and so it's pretty, thinking of her when I come here, so it's just kind of fun. And what an impact she made on my life and lots of other folks as well in there. Well, what I want to do, and we're going to sort of talk about it, and we call it historiography. That's sort of the story of history, just a little bit about the Old South. Because a lot of people are like, well, what in the world? Because Texas was part of the Old South. So we have to talk about what it was like. And so I like to just throw a few things out. If you were studying, say, Texas history or Southern history back before about 1930, it actually was read like Gone with the Wind. Well, everybody who was white had a plantation, and the slaves enjoyed being slaves. It was a good life for them. People today, when you look at it, you read these things. The original book was U.B. Phillips' Life and Labor in the Old South, and you're like, oh my Lance, that's racist, that's ridiculous, that's crazy. But you know what? Historians write from records. In the South, most of the records were by plantation owners. Well, guess what? When they're writing, they didn't make themselves look bad. They would say, I had to go out and chastise a slave today, and it hurt me. But I had to do it. And so they did that. And then if you look at the plantation records, it looks like everybody who's white owned slaves. The slaves are all happy. And that's the way it was written. How it gets changed is kind of funny. It gets changed over several things. Besides, some people just saying, that doesn't make sense on there. In the 1930s, the first sort of chink in that armor, they started doing what were oral histories. They were called folklorists. It's part of the WPA. And they went and interviewed all the known living former slaves. Okay, you can actually go, I can never remember, it's the Library of Congress and National Archives. I just Google slave narratives, and it comes up. And they interviewed them, and it tells a story. And all of a sudden, they even could put together, well, the one that's I chastised says, well, he comes out and he gets that whip and he beats her till her hand is like her back is like raw meat, and she passes out on there. And it's the same guy who said, I had to chastise someone today. And so it's a completely different, so people said, wait a minute, they can't both be right. And so that was one of the first where that's coming up. Interestingly enough, if you want to know more about that, you can, about 15 years ago, somebody, a librarian somewhere, bless his heart, wonderful fella, said, you know what? I bet we've got all these old, and they were on big dictabelts that were about this wide, about 8-10 inches wide, foot wide, that they had recorded those things. Those things were like 400 or 500 pound machines. Why don't we digitize them? And we can get rid of all that static that doesn't sound good, everything's really bad, so we can get rid of that. And so they did that, and so you can actually go and on the website play these oral histories these guys did. And it shakes you up, to be quite honest. And then when you think about it, you're hearing someone in the 1930s talking about something from before 1860. My favorite one was a fellow named Fountain Hughes. He was not from Texas, but he was talking about slavery. And he was 103, 104. He was born in the 1830s. He was 103, 104 when they interviewed him. And he is horrified with the way people talk about slavery in these books. It wasn't like that at all. And then what he ends with, I'll never forget. He said, you know what I tell my family, told my kids and my grandkids, and told them even their great-grandkids, said if they ever try and bring that slavery back again, to kill yourself, because the dogs were treated better than slaves were. That helped bring an end to this idea of, well, everybody who was white owned slaves liked being slaves. It was a wonderful life. Okay. What got the difference, though? What about the common person? Because it was still being said, well, everybody who was white owned slaves. There was a guy, Frank Owsley, and he does book. Back then, if you wanted to study Southern history, what'd you do? You go to the Columbia University up in New York City. That's where Southern history was studied. He studied under U.B. Phillips, and he would tell us, okay, now go back and write a book on what the antebellum South was like in your state. He was from Alabama, so he wrote one on Alabama. It's out there. He's great. He loves his book. He's a new professor, Ph.D. from Columbia, book out, and he gives it to his grandparents. His grandparents read it and said, "You're wrong." "What? You can't say you're wrong." "You're wrong. That's not the way it was." And he says, "Well, he says, you just don't know what you're talking about. We lived there." So there were no slaves in the county we were from. Your family's from. No one in your family ever owned any slaves. So how can you say, "Well, no, you don't know what you're doing"? You just don't know what you're doing. So Owsley did something that no one else ever did, and that is he is going to look at the records of the Census Bureau. And he found his grandparents were right. The county his family was from was up in the hills, there, the foothills of the mountains. There weren't any slaves in the whole county. And he's like, well, okay, well, what was life like? What he did was he started doing this research into the people who, he called them the plain folk. What was their life like? Well, this was so unheard of. He started this in the late 30s. World War II interrupts, so nothing gets done historical because they all are in the military. He comes back, he finishes up, and it was published about 1948, 49, something like that. Plain Folk of the Old South on there. The text is only about 120 pages long. He has 80 pages of footnotes, or I guess endnotes, because he said, nobody will believe me. I've got to prove it. And for the first time, people started looking at, what happened? That's not what we all heard. That's different. And so that's where we get this. That's where the first effort on that was made. Interestingly enough, on the 50th anniversary of the publication, the Southern Historical Association had a special session. Now, he was dead by this time, but his wife, Harriet, and his son was there. And actually, when you see a later edition, it'll say by Frank Owsley and Harriet Owsley, because she had helped him do the research and writing, but they wouldn't publish it at first with her name on it. Times have changed, thankfully, on there. But in that, and they did it as being one of the most important times in Southern history on how it changes it. But nobody really did anything with it again until you get a final book on this subject called Cracker Culture. This came out in the early 90s. Well, cracker is a rather derogatory term for, as my mom would have said, poor white trash. Okay? These were the poor whites. What was their life like on there? And I have to tell you, I come from, on my mom's side, a long line of sharecroppers, so I fall into this classification very well. So Grady McWhinney goes through this, and he looks at what life was like across the South. In doing this, he said, now this only, what he calls the Celtic thesis, explains everything. He kind of overstated it. It's not everything. It is an important, perhaps one of the most important out there, perhaps the most underrepresented idea. But it's not the only thing, okay? And that's when historians rarely will say it is the only way, because you find one exception, you just blown it. And I'm afraid that's what happened for a while. People are like, well, what about so-so? And they disregard his book. Then after about 15 years, people started saying, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Now, I knew Dr. McWhinney, and he was an irascible old fella on there. Just to give you, he's the perfect absent-minded professor, one of those old funny little notes. His first book came out, and he didn't know what to do. He got a royalty check and someone, here, I've got this company to invest in. And he was at Wayne State University in Detroit, so he said, okay. And then he got a job like 2 months later at another university. And so he said, I don't even remember what the guy was, some alphabet company. And so that was in the 50s. And the company, because they couldn't find him, just kept reinvesting the dividends in stock. And in the 1990s, they found him. And that little alphabet company was IBM. And he had told us, don't ever do that kind of investing because you don't. And so I'd gotten the story when he didn't know what ever happened to it. And he would have made actually quite a few $1 million off of that. So if you're going to do it, that's a good way. But he's somewhat absent-minded. Now, this was then done on Texas. He did this looking at the whole South. Then Dr. Vista McCroskey did a lot of what I did some of the work too, looking at this, how it applies in Texas. Okay? And so while this whole Celtic thesis and all of that really applies from everywhere, really from Georgia all the way into East Texas, this would not be true of, say, Bexar County, San Antonio. Okay, it wouldn't be there. It wouldn't be the hill country with the German population. It wouldn't be true of North Texas and the Peters Colony around Dallas. But pretty much the rest of East Texas, it's appropriate. Okay, so that's all background. Boy, it's a long background. Way talking too much on there. Let's look at what the Celtic thesis is. Now, the map on the I guess left as you look at it, yeah, on there shows what are called the Celtic areas or the Celtic fringe of the British Isles. You can see Scotland, Ireland, Wales, and Cornwall. What happened, the Celts were the original folk, as best we can tell, in the British Isles. And then later, Germans, the Anglo-Saxons, Jutes, hence Anglin for Anglo-Saxon, Angles, came over. And then after that, you get some Vikings, you get the Normans coming in. Well, the original ones were the Celts, and they kept getting pushed out further and further to the north and further to the west. And so that's why we call it the Celtic fringe. I often say the easiest way to think about King Arthur. He was Anglo-Saxon, Merlin was Celtic. Okay, he was there first on there. And so what his Celtic thesis is, sort of real quick, and then we're going to tear it apart, and what it was like here in Texas, was that these Celts from Scotland, from Ireland, from Wales, from Cornwall, became most of the population of the South. Now, not the Virginias or Carolina. Those were people who came over, but from the frontier South over were usually those people coming from the Celtic fringe, and they brought with them their lifestyle. And then it even morphed into even a little bit different lifestyle here. So, looking at it like that, in the middle is St. Patrick. What's St. Patrick famous for? I always joke, not green beer. He's probably most famous for his role in bringing and converting the Irish to Catholicism, to Christianity at that point. My wife says what he used to say was most important was that he got rid of all the snakes in Ireland. I don't know if you know that. There are no snakes indigenous to Ireland. They're all gone. What he did, and it's an interesting story, he came back and he said, okay, I've got to teach these Celts about sin and all. And he said, so the snake was the old serpent, the devil from the Bible. So we're going to run it out of Ireland. Well, how do you do that? With hogs. And so he introduces for the first time hogs to Ireland. Now then, hogs love snake. And actually, they're omnivores. They eat plant. They also eat meat. But they love snake. It's like their favorite thing. But a snake can't hurt them. They can't get through that pigskin. You think it's tough enough for a football? It's tough enough that the snakes can't get through it. I remember years ago, I took a group of students out to the Martin Farm out in Armand Bayou for there, and we're walking around, and we're going over there, and all of a sudden, Dr. Weller, they stopped me out, and there goes this snake right across in front of me. Oh, thanks, then we'll do it. And the snake made one mistake. It went, and there's this old pen over here with two enormous hogs that we'd been watching, then we'd walked around. They haven't moved all day. That snake gets there, and those two things were up, and one at each end ate that snake until it was gone, and until their snouts met in the middle. And I thought, okay, I've always heard it, now I've seen it. They were like, oh, that was great. You couldn't beat that. And so he does that, and he gets rid of, as I say, all the snakes from Ireland, but it also introduces something new to Irish culture. And what it introduces into Irish culture is swine herding. And that became one of the biggest ways that Ireland, come on in, that Ireland ever had on people making a living, was herding. And so that's one of the things to talk about. And this is some of the background. Another piece of background before we get, I do way too much background, don't know, but try and tell the story here. Do you have any idea, and there might be a hint up there, the first 10 Irishmen of Irish descent, not Englishmen living in Ireland, but Irishmen in Ireland to make $1 million. You know what they all had in common? They owned a brewery, a distillery, or a pub. The Irish, well, they kind of like to drink on there. And so they're going to bring that. They're going to bring the hogs over. A couple of other things on the Irish. It was beneath the men in Ireland to do farm work. That was women's work. Now, the livestock, okay, that's like hunting. You could be hunters and you could be warriors. The other thing you could do, interestingly, you could make a living with your mouth. If you could talk and tell a good story and can make a living, that was okay. But farming, that's women's work. Men aren't supposed to do that. They don't do any of the kind of work like that. But hunting, fighting on there, or if you could, like I said, if you're a professor, a teacher, a lawyer, anything where you make, a priest making your money with your mouth, that was good. And so they allowed that. So play that then into the background. Okay, what I want to do is talk about what happens when a family is going to go. So we're just going to now just sort of dive in to daily life and talk about some of the fun things. What happens? Okay, let's say there's a couple going to get married. Okay, so they're going to get married. One of the first things they have to do is they're going to need a place to live. Now, interestingly enough, because your wealth was tied up in your livestock, in the hogs, and at the same time it was an open range system, you didn't need any land. And so they became squatters. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Let's put our cabin here. Because the land, they didn't own the land. They weren't worried about it. It wasn't a problem on there. Everything they had was tied up, as you'll see, into their livestock. So they're going to have to find a place for that. By the way, the number one gift for a couple getting married was like, let me loan to you a sow and a boar and 2 or 3 sows, or somebody else, I'll give you a couple of sows for 2 years. You get to keep all the pigs after that, piglets, and they become your own hog herd, and then you give us back those. And just for the record, a boar is not a history professor. It's not, I promise. Hopefully, anyway, on there. So they're going to do that. So they have to get this cabin. Now, a cabin raising is an amazing time. Everybody loves it. So what are you going to do? Well, everybody comes. Everybody far and wide. And they bring all the food they can, and you get started. Remember I said they kind of like to drink? They start with a little whiskey in their coffee, and whiskey's never more than an arm's length away from them all day long. So you had to build fast. And so one of the big things we're going to build this to get it up, because after about 2:30 or 3 in the afternoon, that thing's starting to lean just a little bit on there. So you don't want to have that. That's a real problem if you get that. Now then, when it's over, when they say, okay, we're going to quit now, what happens? The men will say, okay, ladies, y'all need to gather everything and leave and take the little kids with you. We're going to have our fight now. Say, what? They weren't mad. They just always ended with a fight. That was part of the warrior culture. We're going to just, have a nice knockdown, drag out fight, not side versus side, just hit anything that moves at that point. Don't feel too sorry for them, though. They're pretty well pickled by this time, and it won't hurt till tomorrow. At this point, there's not a whole lot there. Plus, on the other side, the strikes aren't going to be as painful either, because they're going to miss more than they hit. It just happens on there. One of the other interesting little sides of this, for the kids, for the guys, for the boys, the day their dad says, you can stay for the fight, he's moving into manhood. And there's 2 points to this. One, he gets to stay for the fight. Number 2, he gets to drink for the first time. And the story is no kid ever saw their first fight, because they were passed out drunk before the first fight hits on there. But they get into it. It's a brawl. It's a fight. I often joke. It actually goes back to Dr. McWhinney. He said he called it the best movie on Ireland, on the Irish people, and this is back in the 80s, that was a John Wayne movie called The Quiet Man. It actually ends with 2 brothers-in-law fighting for 15 or 20 minutes, been leading up to that, and in the end, they're drunken with arms around each other, having a grand and glorious time at that point. Because you fight and it's over and you're having fun after that. And so that was the aspect of what was happening on building it up like that. Now then, what you built was a single log cabin like this. Okay, so you build that up, and by the way, there would be, depending on where downwind is, that's where you're going to have this other little bitty building. It's a one-holer, hopefully. But you don't want to have it ever catch fire, because the odor will be bad on there. But it's not right by the house, and it's bad in the winter or the rain. It's raining, you have to go to the bathroom, and you're going to get wet. But they do build that. That's actually usually built before the house. And that's all that they really have there. So what is life like for those folks? Well, they don't own much land, but they have these hogs. Hogs are very prolific, okay? Their favorite food, I said, are snakes. I'm just curious. Have you ever seen a snake in Texas? They had an unlimited food supply. The other thing they really like are acorns and nuts of different types. And while we talk about the East Texas piney woods, and those piney woods go all the way to the Carolinas, all throughout the pine in the native areas, not the ones that have been clear cut and replanted, you got oaks all throughout and hickory and things, so they eat those on there. In fact, there's an old East Texas saying, even a blind hog finds an acorn every now and then. And it goes back, they root around like that and find something. And so for the hog, this is heaven, okay? No real, anyone out there, the predators who would eat it, take it except for other people, the people there, on there. All the snakes and acorns you can find, which is a lot on there. This is a wonderful life for the hogs. And they reproduce extremely fast and don't need much help in doing it. So those 2 or 3 hogs like that you were given from all these different families giving you that a year or so, you've got your own hog. Now, when the piglets are born, you actually then cut the ears. You clip the ears. Sort of like branding a cow would be, okay? You clip a pattern on the ear, and that's your hog. And then when new piglets come around, that hog, okay, those are mine. That's how you separate them, and you keep doing it. It actually was an offense you could be jailed for, and usually were, if you had a hog without their ears, because the assumption is you've stolen it. So they can't prove it, and back then that didn't matter. You were going to be found guilty if you had a hog without ears. And so these things grow. Now then, the men were in charge of the livestock. You don't have anything to do. It's easy. What do? Well, you have to gather them up when the pigs are born to clip their ears. And then you sell these hogs. But you don't even have to do much work on there. A guy will come through, a drover will come through and say, I'll be back in about 2 weeks and I'll pay gold for any hogs you have. Okay. So for that 2 weeks, you have a little pen, you gather up the hogs you want to sell. And they get those hogs and he sells them to you, and it's his job to get them to market, not yours. So you don't have much work there. So what were men doing? It was a hard life. Very hard. One of the things, they had to go hunting and fishing. And I mean to tell you, it was a tough life to have to go hunting and fishing. I'm sorry, ladies, we've got to go hunt and fish. That's just our job on there. I can't tell me men say, can we go back? Well, there's some other problems. Like I said, the outhouse. If nothing else, you don't want to go back when you have outdoor plumbing. But on there, that's what they did, hunting and fishing on there. And, of course, they're fighting. Now the farming, what about that? The wives did that. The wives plowed it. The wives planted it. The wives got rid of any weeds if they got rid of them. The wives harvested it. The wives cooked it. So the husbands ate. They contributed their part. They ate, right? That's why we say, so Texas was heaven for men and dogs, and hell on women and oxen. They're doing the real work there. The men and the dogs go out hunting and fishing, and the women and the oxen are doing all the real work there. And by the way, I probably ought to point this out. You have to fence in anything you don't want the hogs to get into. And the reason for that, it's an open range system. And those hogs just go in there. They root around. They're going to get your potatoes, which were a big thing by the time you get to Texas. The Irish are growing those. And you can grow a lot of potatoes in a very short time. You can grow a lot of potatoes as such, so you have a lot of that going on. They liked things that could be dried, like potatoes, carrots, onions. They would grow onions like that. Also beans on there. But when they plow that, they put the fence around it, keep the hogs out, and then you got the food for the rest of the year. Okay? Now for the men, their job, besides the other, was corn. They would grow, and they would actually plow the ground to put the corn in. Not all of them. Some still had their wives do it, but this was important stuff, so the men would do it. And they would plant the corn. And they would take that and make it into the still, into moonshine, like that. Now, this is one of those interesting moments. Do you realize you could make more money off one jug of whiskey than a whole wagon load of corn? You can take 2 jugs tied over your mule, tied together and over the neck of the mule, and transport it. You know how hard it was in these rural areas to get things in a wagon? Because there weren't good roads. So it is financial. Bluebell used to have an old slogan that said, we eat all we can and we sell the rest. Well, that was sort of their way with moonshine. We drink all we can and we sell the rest. And they made a lot on there. I don't know if you ever had moonshine. I often joke about this when I'm talking about the students about it. One time in my life, I was 13, Boy Scout camp up in the mountains of Arkansas, and I come back and I go in this area, and it's what's called, we would have called it a hemmed in holler. Now that, for those who are not from Arkansas, is in fact a boxed canyon with foliage in front of it, meaning it looks, all of a sudden you realize, well, the cliff goes way back, and you didn't realize that. So I knew the scout camp pretty well, so I go moseying back this little trail of water, go back there, and I walk into a double-barrel shotgun. What are you doing? Luckily, I looked like a kid and had on a scout t-shirt. I'm on scout camp. This isn't scout property. Actually, it was. But even as obnoxious as I was at 13, I knew you don't argue with a double-barrel shotgun. I said, oh, I'm so sorry. He said, okay. He said, well, you need to get out of here. Yes, sir. I'm about to go. You thirsty? Yeah. He gave me a mason jar with a clear liquid with no smell. I thought it was water. Oh, good. I have never drank gasoline, but it couldn't have hurt worse. I think it got, because I just slugged it, and it got about here and came back out on there. Now, the next year, I went looking with some friends. I told them, okay, let's go find it. And we found where it had blown up. The steel had blown up. That's one of the real problems. Alcohol is highly flammable. And you're cooking it over a stove. And we found it big old burned out. Now, I don't know if that meant it blew up or if the revenuers, as they would have said, the old tax agents had found it and blew it up. You know, I don't know. But it was there. That's a big part of their life is, in fact, their alcohol. It's a joyful time for them on there. Now then, as they're going along, everything's fine. They've got quite a few kids coming along on here. They're still in that one-room cabin, okay? That's all they've got on there. And what they do is they have up in the roof, we're going to show how to get a dog trot, that primary room, that's the original room that they'd had. They have a sleeping loft up there where the kids slept and mom and dad would sleep down. Where we find out, by the way, all these stories I'm telling you are what are called travelers' accounts. People back before the Civil War, they'd take a trip and they'd write it all up and get it published and then give it out as a Christmas present. You think it's hard looking at somebody's Facebook pictures? Try if they give you a book and want you to read it about, oh, I went and did this, this, and this while you stayed home. Well, that's what it is. It's really obnoxious, except now historians, we love it because it's what they saw. It's a great record. And so I think it's University of North Carolina has the best collection of these on there. And so we look at these travelers' accounts, and that's where they find out what happens, how the second cabin gets built. Because it's always planned to have these front two and the breezeway in between them. That was always supposed to be there, but the wife would nag and it wouldn't get done. Oh, I'll get around to it someday. Never gets done, never gets done. Every time I have seen something where they talked about how they built the second cabin made a dog trot or double log cabin, it's just a variation of basically the same story. Shall we say, mom and dad were having fun wrestling at night, and one of the kids came down, and mom threw dad off and said, not again, as long as those kids, until we have our own cabin. And within a week, a cabin was built. 10 years of nothing, 6 years nothing, and in a week, guys can build a cabin when they have to on there. And so it gets built into those two. Now, eventually, and then they put the porch out front. You see the two shed rooms up there. One of those will often become like a girl's room, and the boys still sleep up top. And often these get built when your sons get old enough to help you on there. The second one could be a kitchen sometime. They'd put it on there or something of that nature. Sometimes they might only have one of those, not both of them, okay? Now, years later, these things can be built. If you've ever been down to the Varner hog plantation, for instance, it's called raising the roof. They raised the roof, pulled another one under it, and this is what the Varner hog plantation looks like. It's really kind of amazing, and if they will go back, and they pulled, at least at one time, they'd pull the plaster and put plexiglass over, and you could see the logs from where it was originally a double log cabin. You wouldn't, to look at it, looks so beautiful, you're like, really, that was a double log cabin? And it was. And they just closed off the back and made that the hallway, you know. So you get started, you're doing this, the life. So what was the life like for them? It's pretty fun. They enjoy it, okay? I always joke after you've had the big cabin raising, okay, the next day at church, because they all went to church, they're all there in church, and it's like the minister who's been trying, you shouldn't be drinking. And he's the only one not drinking, and actually may have been drinking on the side. Anyway, you shouldn't be drinking on. And so here are all these men in church hungover. Ladies, if you love your husband, turn to him and sing as loudly as you can. And they would sing. You could just see the men wilt. How horrible it was at that time. But their life was fun, okay? How do we see that? They don't complain. There's no written record of this, though, because they're also illiterate. They're storytellers. It's the oral tradition on there. You may have heard of someone of Irish descent, someone saying you kissed the Blarney Stone, which meant you could just talk forever. People said my mom kissed the Blarney Stone when she was pregnant with me, but I'm not certain that's accurate on there. But you can talk and talk, and so they tell stories. I know, because I have a lot of Celtic blood in me, that I can tell stories that my grandmother told, that her grandmother told, and can probably get them as well as she did, just because you heard them and you repeated them. My son complains about that nonstop. I've heard that story 100 times. Yes, and someday your kids will too. But it's in your blood. You can't help it. You get old, you start telling those old stories on them. I like to look at some of these things to talk about on one of the traveler's accounts. I think, and I can't remember now, it's embarrassing, I think it was from Frederick Law Olmsted's Travels to Texas. And he's writing about this one time in East Texas. And he's heading west, and he sees, and back then, you just stopped at a cabin, no big deal on there. And they, oh, sure, come on in, spend the night on there for the summer. Everybody slept out on the breezeway. It was not a big deal, and you ate. It was just normal for everybody to eat together, have a great time together on there. And so I said, come do that. I said, okay. On there, so he's looking like that he's going to do that. But this house, he says, was kind of leaning a bit, and it looked run down. And he's like, oh man, I don't know if I want to go up there, but then, I might, even if I did, I want to take their food. He's got that kind of real worry. And then this guy, he starts going, this fellow says, hey, aren't you going to come join us? And he's like, well, I thought of going to town. About that time, you hear thunder, and you can see lightning west of him. He says, you ain't going to make it to town before that rain hits. You probably won't make it tonight now. Come on in. And he's thinking, I really probably had better, because this is what's happening here. And so he's going to do that. He goes up there. And so he's talking with the people, and they walk inside, and he's thinking, they must have one time had money, and they really fell on hard times, because they had a couple of well-oiled lamps. They had actually had a clock, unheard of on that, because those were expensive. Just an old cabin like that. So then it comes time to eat. And he writes, I felt guilty because I probably got all the meat they're going to have for a week or more, because they gave it, because they had company. They had like ham, had maybe pork shoulder. He was talking about all the different meats. Had chickens there and all this. What he didn't realize is that's what they ate like that all the time. Because the wife also had chickens, raised chickens, and for both the eggs, and let them grow up like that. So it's like that was just normal. But he thought, oh no, I'm getting all their meat like that. Well, he says, and then they start going to get the food. He says, it's horrible. It's like everybody's arms are going 90 to nothing over there, and people are throwing stuff. You better get something, you ain't going to have anything left. And they kept putting stuff on his plate on there, but they said it was good. On there, he's eating. Afterwards, they go out on that front porch that's along there, and they're passing around a jug. Now, he says he tried to clean it. I get a kick out of that. That sucker just sloshed a little alcohol and it self-sanitizes. That stuff was so alcoholic. So he puts the jug up there, and it was like his second time to take a drink. He lifts it up, and a hog nuzzles him right there. And he goes, get away from me like that. And he turns back around. The guy's got a gun on him. How dare you? Don't you ever hit my hog again. He's like, I won't, I promise. He says, okay, puts his gun up. And he goes on about, he's writing about how decadent. First off, they let the hogs in the house. Well, the folks, being on the porch or in the breezeway, animals were allowed on that. They weren't allowed inside the rooms. Nobody thought anything about it. Second, that's his livelihood. And all those things in there. Now, I will say this about what happened with their money. They get the gold. They have all the food they can eat, everything they need right there. But what happens to that gold? Well, you know what? Mama gets to buy whatever Mama wants. Her life is murder, but so-and-so got them a lamp. You can get you one too. Okay, and so they go buy them a lamp or a clock. And so some of these sharecropper farms, I'm not sure they will later be sharecroppers. I'm sorry. Some of these old homes like this, they had some really almost extravagant things for the time. because guy's at least smart enough to know he's got it made. Wife's doing all the real work. Like, yeah, if you want that, go ahead and get that. You can have that. And so they would. Now, this was the basic common folk of the Old South and of East Texas. And there are people say, well, but cotton was king, those plantation owners controlled it, they could have ruined it. Actually, they couldn't. The state they had the most power in was in South Carolina. And they tried time and again to try and end the open range system so that you couldn't have on there. And the voters would vote it down every time. And why? Because all the plain folk voted. You know why? They also gave out whiskey on election day. They all showed up, vote, and get their whiskey and have a good time. And they almost always voted Democratic, not Whig, in the Old South on there too. So if I'm a plantation owner and your hog got on my plantation and I hurt your hog, I had to reimburse you for the hog. And if it ate 5, 6, 7, 10 rows of cotton, well, you should have had a stronger fence. That's my problem, That's what the open range system meant. This was the middle class of the South. Never owned slaves, never planned or wanted to own slaves. That was so far from their mindset that you just didn't do that. This was their lifestyle. Where would you put a slave? I don't mean that wrong, but do you see, that just would never have entered their mind on there. Then the war comes, the Civil War. Both armies will live off the land. Those southern hog herds are absolutely decimated. Elisha Hunt Rhodes, who was a private from Iowa, I believe it was, complained in some letters home. He said, it was terrible. We got sick because we've never eaten such rich food. We had meat every meal. And we're not used to that, and they'd get sick from it. With the war over, so were the hog herds, and these people have nothing left to do. Interesting, I don't use Texas in the number, I use the rest of the South. The reason I use Texas is because cattle throws it off when you do just livestock. Because after the war, cattle production coming out of the Nueces Valley is enormous on there. But when you look at the rest of the South, it does not reach its 1860 livestock production until 1940. And that's not in inflation dollars. Those are in actual dollars, which led many to say they to this day have not reached their 1860 production. So what do these people do? They became, in much of the South, sharecroppers. They'd never been really farmers, especially cotton farmers, in their entire life. But their way of life was over. In Texas, many became sharecroppers in East Texas, or the salvation for them was the cattle kingdom. And they hired on to be in the cattle driving industry, things like that. So that was the big part. Well, this way of life ceased to exist. They were the warriors, by the way. They all signed up to fight because you were supposed to do that. So a little bit about what life was like in Antebellum, East Texas.